Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Aleksei Arbuzov's play Tanya. So this is a propaganda piece, as much Soviet drama was, but it's an interesting and unique propaganda piece because it doesn't foreground the role of the state or like the glory of the Soviet Union, the Soviet system, the communist system, Bolshevik or Marxist-Leninist ideology. It foregrounds the personal experience. So the play revolves around, as you might guess, a protagonist named Tanya. She is a young woman who undergoes a profound transformation over the course of the play. In a way, it's a bildungsroman, right? It's a coming-of-age story where she moves not just from being slightly younger in her around age 20 when the play starts to sort of mid-20s when the play ends, but she grows as a person in a way that, at least according to the editors of classic Soviet plays, is sort of central to Arbuzov's dramaturgy, right? This sort of movement from individualism, egoism, in a way. The play uses that term, or at least this translation does, that sort of individualist ideology, moving toward finding value in work, and specifically work that is oriented toward others. And that's Tanya's profound transformation over the course of the play. And this helps her sort of grow as a person, grow into herself, to develop self-confidence, etc., right? So when the play starts out, Tanya is living in a flat in Moscow with her husband, Herman. She was training to be a doctor, but she's given that up, basically just to be with Herman. So this is one of Tanya's sort of fundamental character traits, especially in the early portion of the play, is this very high degree of empathy, but also this sort of need to, there's a sort of high degree of dependence on someone else, another individual, to underpin Tanya's self-conception, right? So at one point, Herman asks her, "Don't you regret it giving up the institute? You would have been a doctor this spring. You only had one more year to go before your finals." And Tanya says, "There you go again. You should never mention it to me. I love you, and to love means to forget oneself, to forget for the sake of the person one loves. I'm willing to sit up night after night over your drawings because your works become my own, because you are me." And Herman says, "Yes, but you can't go on living my life forever." So what we're seeing here is a sort of weird paradoxical egoism, but also erosion of the ego, right? The idea that yourself is myself. What it means to be in love is that I give up myself to become not even necessarily part of you, but to become you, right? Because this is the thing about this that's particularly striking, is that it's not we are in love, so we should each give up ourself for the other. It is we are in love, so I give up myself for you. But there's no expectation on Tanya's part that Herman gives up himself for her. So, of course, there's an interesting and strikingly self-evident gender dynamic here. But I think from Arbuzov's perspective, the overall sort of movement of the play, what's more striking here is this sort of idea of I devote myself exclusively to one person, right? There's an individualist mentality here. I have no need to become a doctor or to be socially useful because I can be useful to one person, right? So that sort of isolating, atomizing conception of the self or of the family unit, as opposed to the sort of larger structure of Soviet society, which is very collectively oriented. And the problem becomes that Tanya does not find sustainable happiness with Herman, in part because he falls in love with another engineer. So he's an engineer. I probably should have mentioned that. That was what the drawings were about, right? He's designing electric dredges for mines, and she does his drawings, right? The engineering drawings, the drafting. He falls in love with an engineer named Maria Shamanova, and Tanya sort of overhears them. Shamanova, to her credit, is basically like, "No, man, you're married. Your wife's cool. Fucking, we can't be together even if we want to." And Herman's like, "No, that's not. We're gonna work this out." Tanya overhears all of this, and so she leaves Herman. But she's got a kid now that Herman doesn't know about. So this is one of the things, right? Is that on the night that she was going to tell Herman that she is pregnant with their child, she overhears this conversation and she pieces out. So she goes to live with a woman named Dusia. Dusia had been their servant. And actually, sort of at the time that this happens, the same night, Dusia comes to tell Tanya that she is going to leave service because. So what she says here is, "I've come to see you on business, Tanya Alexievna." That's Tanya's full first name and patronymic, right? Within the Russian naming system, it's you get an individual first name and then a middle name derived from your father's name and then your family name. So her father would have been Aleksei. So Tatyana Alexievna. That's whatever. It is what it is. That's Tanya, is the short version of this. Please don't take offense. I'm very fond of you indeed, but let's arrange for me to leave on the 15th. I'll work till the 15th and then I'll leave. My brother wants me to go to his factory, and they have technical courses there in the evening. All the lads are trying to talk me into it. I want to study, Tanya Alexievna. I want to be an engineer, like Herman Nikolaevich. And Tanya says, "And do you think it's easy to become an engineer?" And Dusia says, "No, I realize it's hard. Of course, this is my first year in the city, and I only finished primary school in the country, but I've nothing to be scared of. I'm only 17, and I have a terrific urge to learn. Why should I spend my youth working for other people? All roads are open to me." And so this is the endorsement of the Soviet system, right? This is the endorsement of the ideology that says the working class has opportunities for advancement, for upward mobility, for creativity, for education in ways that they never, ever had in old Russia, Imperial Russia under the Tsar. And that's true enough. I mean, again, this is I've talked about this before in videos about these Soviet plays. This is one of the things that people often do not sort of give the Soviet Union and places like the People's Republic of China, Cuba, places like this. They often don't give these countries, these communist countries, sufficient credit for raising the overall standard of living and creating opportunities, creating resources that were unimaginable to the vast majority of people under the previous system, right? Under the previous way of organizing society, the idea that a peasant girl from the country could come to the city, find a job, and then leave that job to go and work in a factory where she would take technical courses and study to be an engineer, that would never have happened under the Tsarist system. It was completely unimaginable. And yet, under the Soviet Union, it could happen. Now, again, that's not to sort of endorse the Soviet system and say that they were great and angelic and good at everything. They clearly were not. But they did do an excellent job sort of creating these opportunities. And it's built on an ethos of service and the interconnectedness of service and the personal, right? So Dusia wants to become an engineer because it is a way of being socially useful, as much as it is a way for her to fulfill her own desire to learn, her desire for advancement, etc., etc. And so these two things are interconnected for the character in a way that they are not yet for Tanya. And we know this because when Tanya's baby, I think she names him Yuri, because that was the name that Herman always wanted. Yeah. So Tanya names her baby Yuri because that was the name that Herman always wanted, but he gets sick with diphtheria, which is an illness that can very easily kill children. It was fairly common in the early portion of the 20th century. And when the doctor shows up to treat Yuri, Tanya sends the doctor away. And she says repeatedly, "I'll do everything myself." Now, part of this is a sort of manic breakdown. Basically, her child is sick. This child that she has now devoted her life to, built her world around in place of the relationship with Herman. So this child is sick, and there is a degree of panic, right? She's losing it. The problem is that she has no lecture notes from her medical studies about the treatment of diphtheria. And Yuri dies. Now, we don't know, we can't know within the structure of the play whether or not Yuri would have lived if Tanya had allowed the doctor to treat him. Almost certainly the chances that he would have survived would have gone up. So this becomes part of the thing, right? This is, in a way, within the logic of the play, the penalty for Tanya's individualism. I will do everything myself. I do not need others. I do not need help or support or assistance. I will do whatever whatever needs to be done. I don't require a larger collective. And again, she's punished for this with the death of her baby. But this also spurs her growth because in part 2 of the play, Tanya has become a doctor and she is working in Siberia. She is traveling around, basically working for the gold mining cooperative in Siberia. And she's working very, very hard. And she has sort of found a kind of purpose. But it's not yet a fully developed purpose, right? So, and this is a sort of interesting bit that Arbuzov is working through here, this sort of question of, it's not just an issue of working for others, it's also an issue of one's ethos, one's ethical stance. So she meets this guy. She has shown up in a traveler's hostel in the middle of the night, having been working on a case. She's going back And she meets this guy named Ignatov. And Ignatov, she doesn't know this at the time, but Ignatov is like the district administrator. So he's basically the guy who's sort of in charge of the whole region. And he says to her, they have this conversation in the middle of the night. She says, but none of this matters. Ignatov says, then what does matter in your opinion? Tanya says that I feel useful here. The rest is not vital. Only work can bring true happiness. All the rest is fantasy, lies. Ignatov says, everything? Tanya says, yes. Ignatov says, even friendship? Tanya says, true friendship takes time, and that's something I don't happen to have here. Ignatov says, you probably believe that solitude makes a person strong. Beware of that idea. It leads to egoism. So this becomes the thing, right? This becomes the interesting crux for me, at least, in Tanya's development as a character, is she is at a stage where she recognizes that work is what produces one's purpose. But, as she puts it, what matters is that I feel useful here. So the orientation is still toward the self. Ignatov is quite right. This is still a form of egoism. And what I mean by that basically is that the character is not properly into the sort of communist mindset of giving up the self for the benefit of the collective. And again, it's a propaganda piece. At the end of the day, it is about the glory of Soviet ideology, etc., etc. What Tanya is doing at this point in the play, to borrow a phrase from Pink Floyd, she has become comfortably numb. And that numbness comes from a sense that I must be useful. I must be useful. I am centered in that equation. But it is only when she receives a call to go out to a remote mining facility that is not part of her normal responsibility, but the doctor who normally is in charge of that mine is, I think, on leave, and the other doctor in the area is sick, so she has to go. She's been out working all day. She's been sort of skiing around because there's been a ton of snowfall. It's Siberia. That's how it goes. And initially she's like, I'm not that keen on going out to this place. I've never been there. I've never worked there. Then they're like, it's a child who's sick. And she's like, okay, I'm going. Then she hears a weather report that's calling for a blizzard. And all of this is like, Ignatiev doesn't hear the weather report, but he's sort of around for all of this. This is happening. This conversation over the phone is basically happening in his office. So he's sort of talking to her about what she should do. So she hears this weather report that there's going to be a big blizzard, and she's like, I can't ski out there in a blizzard. That's a suicide mission. But Ignatiev doesn't hear this. And Tanya sort of has this realization that she needs to go and help this child. And so she goes. She skis out. The blizzard comes in. She basically gets... we don't know exactly what happens. There's some sort of skiing accident. She loses her skis. Her leg is injured, but she is at the very edge of this mining camp that she was trying to get to. And so somebody finds her, brings her into the camp. They revive her. She goes and treats this kid basically on one leg. And only when she gets there does she find out that the child she's been summoned to treat is the son of Herman and Sharonova. I can't exactly remember. Shamanova. So her ex-husband and the woman that he fell in love with, that caused Tanya to leave him, now have a son. Their son is also named Yuri. And that's another thing that Arbuzov does in this play, is there's these sort of repeating names. Semyon Semyonovich is the name of the raven, the baby raven that Tanya and Herman are sort of raising in their apartment in the beginning, and then they release Semyon Semyonovich, and Tanya is very sad about that. Then later on the road in this hostel, she runs into a traveling salesman named Semyon Semyonovich, and she sort of talks about him as though he is a sort of reincarnation of this raven. And so there's a sense that like their Yuri is the reincarnation of her Yuri. So Tanya treats Yuri, heals him, and she comes to this sort of understanding that the real truth is not that what matters is working so that the individual feels useful. What matters is working so that everyone in society benefits, right? So again, this sort of endorsement of the collectivist system, and the idea, and Tanya is basically like, through this, I have made my peace with Herman and what happened between us. I am no longer tied to that person and that pain. I am no longer even tied to the pain of the loss of my child, because I know that I have saved their Yuri, which is, again, on some level, sort of the reincarnation of her Yuri, right? It is a second chance to make right what she, at least in her mind, failed to do with her child, with her iteration of Yuri, right? So by the end, she is sort of profoundly happy and satisfied with herself, because she is no longer internally focused, right? She's no longer focused on what is it that will make me happy. It becomes, what do I do to make others happy? And from that, she derives purpose, she derives self-satisfaction, she derives a sense of self.